This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome. We're just have started our part 3 on environment and development. Unfortunately, we weren't able to connect with you earlier, but I'm sure your presentation will be highly relevant to this segment of the agenda. We've just invited Paul Havemann to start speaking on his chapter, Mother Earth, Indigenous Peoples and Neoliberal Climate Change Governance. So I'm going to invite him to continue, and then I'll invite you to give your summary of your chapter on international human rights standards and Indigenous peoples' land and human rights in Asia. If I may, let me just introduce you first to our audience. So this is, welcome Mr. Raja Devasish Roy, who is the hereditary Chakma Raja and chief of the Chakma Circle in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh. He is also a barrister at Lincoln's Inn in London and an advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh High Court Division. He has been serving as the Indigenous nominated member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since 2011 for the Asian region. And he has been involved in advocacy, research, development, environment, and human rights work for more than 20 years, and has several publications on related matters in Bangladesh and abroad. So welcome very much. We're very pleased to have you. I'm just going to turn you back to the audience, or actually maybe I'll turn you to Paul right now. There's our audience. Welcome everybody. And to Paul, who will continue with this chapter, and then we'll come back to you.
Thanks, Corinne. Greetings. The anthropogenic climate crisis that we presently face is what some people are now describing as the Anthropocene. The planet has shifted into a new geologic phase in which it's no longer nature that is determining the form of the ecosystem in which we live, but it's human beings. So it's a human-caused crisis with increased nitrogen levels, increased CO2 levels, loss of water, and biodiversity collapse. Put all of these together, and there are at least 6 other planetary boundaries that researchers at the Resilience Institute and other places in Stockholm have been working on, that start pointing in the direction of a planet in crisis, where we've crossed the threshold of safety into an unknown territory, and where it's almost impossible to imagine, without radical change, how we can wind back from a world in which, let's just take a simple measure. Once upon a time, the planet existed with about 280 parts per million of CO2. We're now up to 500 parts per million of CO2, and people are suggesting that a safe operating level of CO2 is 350. And then backgrounding that crisis in terms of human interventions which are currently underway, which, in my view, have a profoundly adverse impact on Indigenous people, but are actually false promises in themselves. So the RED scheme, the reduction of deforestation, is a disaster. The clean development mechanisms are a disaster. The joint initiative mechanisms are a disaster. All of these are window dressing for business as usual. Business as usual is the source of anthropogenic climate change and the disaster that humankind faces in the next 50, 20, 10 years. Depends where you live. 5 years. Already now, some people are dying because of climate change. What I look at is the colonization of neoliberal ideas in the UN sector, so that it's the UNEP and the UNDP that are selling a green economy model that is premised on the payment for ecosystem services, which is a form of asset stripping of nature, converting nature into commodities that can then be bought and sold, not by any of the people who created them and not by people who are overusing them, but in some kind of false market in which exchange is taking place, where people are making enormous profits. The rate of profit has grown exponentially, but the rate of growth and the rate of income has been very, very slow. This is the thesis of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital. And it's where we're facing today the crisis of financialization, which is going to produce a financial recession as well as an economic crisis, an ecological crisis. And they're going to be very tightly intertwined. They're Siamese twins, if you like. The good news, if there is good news, the only thing that I've seen that life made me feel remotely optimistic has been the achievement of Indigenous people in terms of advocating an alternative paradigm, both within the UN context, but also at the Cochabamba People's Convention, talking about the rights of Mother Earth, One Vivir as a movement, as a way, a different paradigm for looking at the way in which human beings should interact with each other and governance should take place. So I tried to look at this in terms of my chapter as a way of both posing a very pessimistic outlook, but also saying, well, if, and it's a big if, we could grasp some other vision of the world in which humankind can live in harmony with nature within the safe planetary boundaries, then we might just have a way of achieving some kind of accommodation. Where most of the people nowadays are talking about adaptation, they're not talking mitigation anymore. The old discourse of climate change was all about mitigation. Well, mitigation's, that's yesterday. Adaptation, that's today. And all we're doing is effecting mopping up the mess that we're creating, trying to make it less bad. But we're adapting. And we're going to see peoples having to adapt. And Indigenous people actually offer us very effective models of adaptation because they have lived very close in a biocultural paradigm so that they observe and adapt in a way that those of us who live in ivory palazzos in the big city, we don't see what nature is doing. Some of the people might look out of their window, they don't notice that all the sparrows have died because they've never noticed the sparrows in the first place, let alone the pollinators that are disappearing as we speak. Next time you go into your local hardware store, check out the number of pesticides that are being sold that are full of neonicotinoids, which is killing the pollinator population. So we're in a very difficult space here in terms of living really in an unreal world. We're living without connectedness. What Indigenous people offer us is a sense of connectedness and a sense of how to organize their social order in a fashion which enables people to live harmoniously within the limits. And we have to scale that up. So I'll move to I won't go through all the detail of the carbon market and offsets and why they're a waste of time. I'll just make that kind of broad, crude generalization, but I can deal with that. And just say, well, the conclusions that I came to after doing this work was Cochabamba, C, yes, let's support the Cochabamba Accord. Red and emissions trading scheme, no, let's not go there. The formative conclusions are that I believe that IGOs such as the UN Framework Convention and the IPCC and the big international non-governmental organizations, including the BINGOs, the big environmental organizations, need to radically scale up their commitment to support of Indigenous people. It's not in the chapter, but you'll be aware that at the Paris conference, Indigenous people made very strong representations, and their voices were muted to, I think, 5 references, one in the non-binding part of the protocol, and some in the binding part of the protocol. And they were references to, yeah, maybe we should listen to some traditional knowledge. That was more or less the concession that was made. They don't have a seat on the UN Framework Convention Conference of the Parties. They don't have a particular chapter or leadership group within the International Panel on Climate Change, which nonetheless has made passing reference to the importance of Indigenous people. They are starting to get referenced by the subsidiary bodies of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but not as anything but a kind of privileged observer, let's call it that. And I think that should change. I think that Indigenous approaches to and the cultural values that support them should become very important features of our alleged solutions to the climate crisis. We should reject completely, as Indigenous people, many Indigenous people have done, the commodification of the commons as a solution. Emissions trading, carbon credits, offsets and all this BS is actually simply the commodification of the commons. They're our heritage, they're our children's heritage. If we believe in intergenerational equity, we shouldn't allow the commodification of the commons to occur because it is an asset stripping of the heritage of humankind by a current generation for very short-term objectives. This is big stuff. We should recognise, of course, Indigenous people's right to self-determination, and in particular, engage in a massive titling of Indigenous communal tenure rights in forests and land, and recognise the coterminous interests of Indigenous people and campesino peasant people, because drawing these lines has been very convenient in terms of the divide and rule strategy, but the ontology of people living in many locations is such that they share far more than differentiates them. And it's my view that a declaration of the rights of peasants ought to be just as important on our agenda as a declaration of the rights of Indigenous people. I mean, I'm really glad we got the declaration. That is a fundamental breakthrough because it says so many important things. But I think we've left out a whole lot of very important people along the way. And if I was making recommendations about future research, I would be saying that we have to look to Indigenous people and campesino populations to learn how to engage in agroecology. Life depends on soil. Our current methods of agriculture destroy soil. We cannot support the vast newcoming billions of people that the planet's expecting to have without re-evaluating the way that we consume and produce food. Agroecology provides mechanisms for doing that without destroying the soil. But it involves small scale. It doesn't involve agribusiness. It doesn't involve the commodification of nature in any way. We need to reject the REDD scheme for deforestation. It's been a kind of a scam. Donor countries are simply buying their way out of changing their practices and giving funds to states who then purport to engage in the avoidance of deforestation. But the whole scheme is now crumbling because the people that are making the donations are saying, well, how do you verify it? How do we monitor it? And it's become an extremely fraught area. And it's because it's a scheme that is doomed to fail. It is too complex and too phony. It's a shell game. As Kevin Anderson, one of the leading climate scientists, says, I quote in the chat, he says, unless you've got an offset scheme that you can guarantee will avoid offsets, carbon emissions, for at least a century after the establishment of the scheme, it's not a real scheme at all. it's not doing anything. So what we've got is a situation in which there's a whole voluntary offset. Some of us even buy tickets from airlines in which they're saying they have offsets. This is a big problem. A lot of offsets are in fact being established based on the land grabbing of forests and the planting of plantations. Destroying indigenous people's land and taking it over and saying, here we have a great big plantation that is providing offset. We've got a forest here that's going to produce all these, all the CO2. It's going to be a carbon sink. It's going to absorb CO2 and it's going to produce oxygen. And this is wonderful, but it's again highly problematic. We need to radically support Indigenous participation in governance, which I think we've heard people talking about. We need to activate a two-pronged approach to this, which is human rights-based and ecosystem-based. We've got to bring the ecosystem back into the picture. We've got to consider a biocultural paradigm. And finally, we've got to support the reduction of greenhouse gases through renewables, the reduction of waste. Agroecology is a way of sequestering carbon into the soil, and stop overconsumption and develop sustainable employment. We cannot continue the same model, tinkering with things at the edges. Otherwise, our children and grandchildren are doomed. We need a degrowth economy right now. And so the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, the Cochabamba People's Agreement, are very, very important documents which we should put as the centre of our discussions about where we go from here. And of course they weren't put on the table at all at Paris. That's how much work we've got to do. That's what my chapter is basically saying.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Okay, I'd like to invite Devasish to say a few words now because it's quite late where you are, so thank you for staying up to join us. So we'd like to hear from you for about 10 minutes on your chapter, International Human Rights Standards and Indigenous Peoples' Land and Human Rights in Asia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Corinne. Good evening, good morning, welcome to everybody. My chapter is about land and human rights of indigenous peoples in Asia. Let me start off with what I'd say is a lot of superlatives in Asia. We have the highest population of indigenous peoples, some of the highest safeguards on the constitutional. Can you hear me? I hear a lot of distortion.
Yeah, it might be worth turning off your camera just to limit the distortion a bit.
Okay.
Okay?
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay. I was saying, apart from occupation, Asia also has some of the highest levels of constitutional safeguards on autonomy, land rights, and so forth. Unfortunately, it also has amongst the highest levels of militarization and land alienation, including involuntary destruction, whether through dams, extractive industries, mining, for example, and palm oil industry in Southeast Asia. And one of our very strong problems has been violence against women, violence against children, including girl children. These are some of the overviews I would give. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Some of the sort of overviews, one of the things I mentioned was militarization, and which in Asia actually it's not just very much military presence, but the takeover of civilian administration, whether by law, de jure or in fact, de facto, where electedness, the usual civil bureaucracy, is undermined by military and so-called security considerations, and some of these are against the difficult determination, many of them peaceful, and also against movements, national for human rights. As I mentioned, dislocation is a very, very big concern for us in Asia, and which is connected with alienation, and this can be for industries, particularly extractive industries. We have a lot of hydroelectric dams which have happened, including where we lost just many more dams are in the offing, and then forest laws almost from South Asia to Southeast Asia, and which I would call colonialist, in the sense that state assumes to themselves all rights, any land or forest, and take over and manage it in the way of the, let's say, the British Imperial Forest Department in India, Burma, Bangladesh, Pakistan, where you so-called protect the lands with forest gardens for trophies, and the forest gardens have no rights. But the irony is that after the British government left, many states in South and Southeast Asia became independent, so-called democratic states, where constitutions say all nice things for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. But when you look at the forestry laws, it is still very colonialist. And basically, the government can still take over land and follow the forest. There are some exceptions, like the Forest Dwellers' Rights Act in India and all that, but the major trend is that these rights are subsumed into laws with something called eminent domain, was Philippines call it the Regalian Doctrine, and so forth. Another major concern for many parts of Asia is violence against women, violence against children, including girl children, and they have been rising. Rapes, including by military and security forces, but also others, including settlers, has risen in many, many parts of Asia. And we have not only national military forces, but sometimes military forces of the great powers of the world here. That's a major area of concern. I'd like to now take into basically the major challenges that I write about in my chapter. One of them is the status of indigenous peoples, except Nepal, Philippines, and Fiji. Most Asian governments do not recognize their indigenous peoples as indigenous. And sort of force like autumn is drawn between what they say is indigenous and what is tribe, with indigenous being sort of limited to the Americas and the Asia Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, North and South America, and the other tribes are not indigenous. But that's not what the United Nations now says. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and recent outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in the General Assembly is using the term indigenous. So we can't expect the UN to cater to all the different terminologies of indigenous, tribal, minority, and so forth. But this is that reflects how indigenous people's rights are being treated, in politics, human rights, and so forth. Exclusion from majoritarian systems is what I call it, is not a big challenge, in the sense that everybody has, as an individual, the civil and political rights to vote, to stand in an election. But the rules have been framed during colonial times, or by the nation states, who call themselves democracies, in effect, majoritarian systems, where the rule of the majority runs the country. And so I would say that few indigenous peoples anywhere in the world, apart perhaps from Latin America, say Nepal in recent years, how many words of your national constitution did any members of your peoples or your neighbors contribute? The answer in most cases will be none, not even a comma. So, indigenous peoples were excluded from framing the constitutions of the state, the administrative structures, the political structures, and the laws, including the land laws. So these are some of the challenges we face when, because of our numbers, and also because we lack muscle, we lack money, that we don't get our representatives too. I have two more points that I will finish. A major challenge is customary law. Now in Asia and some countries we have a very strong community, such as in parts of India, some Malaysia, Philippines, and then where I come from, setting up the tracks in Bangladesh, this is somewhat in the middle. But in most of the cases, customary law is not only not recognized, if it is recognized, it's sort of subordinated to statutory law, where it's more in the nature of a user right, a license given by the state at its will, which you can revoke at any minute, particularly in the lands called forest. So the recognition of customary law is a very strong element of the ILO Conventions 169 and 107, which several nations have ratified, is that customary law must be.
So why don't we move for the minute? Deb, are you still there with us?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes. So we've just unfortunately lost Devasish at the end of his talk. I hope you were able to hear his introduction. We'll continue to see if we can bring him back in, but in the meantime, I would like to welcome you to our discussion. So Deb is stepping in from Toronto. We don't have video for you. I don't know if you have video. I know that Skype is a bit new for you, so.
I thought it was here. I think I pressed the right button and there is, but you know, we can, I'll do this disembodied voice.
Okay, well, we can hear you really well. So I'd like to welcome you and invite you to share with us some insights from your chapter, Living Well with the Earth, Indigenous Rights and the Environment. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you for having me and thank you for the introduction. So my chapter was focused on trying to engage with Indigenous intellectual traditions. As Connie pointed out in her introduction, I work a lot with Indigenous knowledge and environmental governance. So what I did with this chapter was scan and look at Indigenous declarations over the last 20 years, basically since Rio, and analyze them, review and analyze them to see what it was that Indigenous peoples didn't want and what did want, and how that narrative changed over the last 2 decades. And I was relating this to my own experience working on environmental issues in Canada, in Ontario, with First Nations, with some of the emerging ideas that were coming out of the work that I was doing, particularly in relation to water governance. And I did see commonalities, and which was interesting. And one of the main ideas or themes that emerged from doing this work on the international declarations to more of the local ones. For example, Chiefs of Ontario has the Anishinaabe, Mishkegawak, and Hongwe water declaration. They're still very much focused on rights, which is the theme of this particular edited volume, but also a theme that emerges around responsibilities and obligations in relation to Mother Earth, which for them would have to be balanced into the future. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, it's cutting out a bit, but more or less it's okay.
Okay, because it sounded really good before. So essentially, a lot of the criticisms that when we look at the discourse that comes out of the declarations, and pretty well at every one of the UN conferences on environment and climate change conferences, is that current idea of sustainable development has not delivered environmental justice or delivered on environmental and Indigenous rights, nor has it delivered on sustainability for the planet. So essentially it's failing, and there's a lot of criticism of this particular work. So what I sought to do was look in those declarations and see what vision that we actually wanted. Because I find that they did have an orientation to basically what you don't want. And, really quite frankly, a lot of academics are super good at diagnosing all kinds of problems, but maybe not so good at figuring out what some of the solutions or alternative visions might be. And I did see these start to be articulated, including what Paul was talking about earlier, which was the idea of the earth itself as having roots. So that's actually not new in Indigenous thought or Indigenous ontology, that the earth would have agency and would be alive, respected as such. But to see it in the international discourse so prominently recently is actually quite new. So what I find is what's coming forward are more Indigenous intellectual traditions. What's the ontology? What's the epistemology? What kind of knowledge is being used to kind of frame the declaration? So, and I have a high degree of respect for these efforts, largely because Indigenous peoples have been marginalized in a lot of these meetings, as Paul pointed out, that still so many different nations have been able to come together to come to a consensus about what they'd like to see. And what they don't like to see. So I have a high degree of respect for these efforts. So what you see is different ontologies and different ideologies in terms of what sustainability means and how to achieve it. Recognition that the status quo is not delivering, as we've seen with intergovernmental panel change. RESET's fifth report in 2014 and UN's World Water Development Report, not looking good for the planet, so clearly it's failing. It's not working for Indigenous peoples or, quite frankly, anybody. So innovation, imagination, and creativity is required, but we need a different paradigm. And one of the ideas is Van Brior, which has been talked about, living well with the earth. So it's not just people living well the way we might think, let's say, in the West, being associated with very high consumption, but it's actually living well with the earth itself, and that there's a relationship based on respect and reciprocity. So you're not living well unless the earth is well. So it's a very different concept than we see in sustainable development. And these ideas are also can be rooted in also Indigenous thought. So some of the insights gained is the Indigenous declarations, environmental declaration, make explicit the links between sustainable development, environmental justice or injustice, rights of the earth, and the exercise of Indigenous rights to self-determination. So in my own tradition, a similar concept might be this idea of Mawdwin, which means a total state of well-being. And basically this concept is, this is what we strive for. It's initially people that we live well we thought well as a people or as a nation, our relationship and obligations to the earth. And the earth is well. So right now it's very traumatized, very contaminated, so a lot of our work is trying to restore that kind of relationship. So we do have a similar concept at the local level. So I think these ideas, whether locally, I think you can scale these up or scale them down because the work has to happen at all kinds of different scales and all kinds of different levels, offers an alternative vision. I don't think there just needs to be one alternative vision. I think that there's such a diversity in the world of Indigenous groups that diversity is a good thing, but we need something different than what we've got right now. This vision recognizes the earth as possessing agency and rights. And Earth also has responsibilities to us as well, except we interfere with the Earth's responsibilities to do what it's supposed to do. So, and these ideas are not new. So they're new in the international realm in terms of the international declarations, but they're actually not new. So when I think about where I come from, being an Anishinaabe person from the Great Lakes, these ideas of the Mawdwin have been around for thousands of years. So they're actually not new at all. What's difficult, the challenge is to have this idea show up and have meaning and impact in contemporary governance, which we're working on, and I think making some inroads. What I think some of the future research might do, if I had lots of time in the world, I think what I'd like to do is in Bolivia and Ecuador, where these ideas of the rights of Mother Earth have been as part of the legal governance system there is to see how well that's working. How is that working? How can the rest of us learn from that? How can we advance ontologically different ideas? They're very long-standing, they're not new. How can we advance them, and what can the impact we've got? Where can they start showing up? We have to move beyond the philosophical reflections and start making it a reality in terms of law and work that we do. And there are opportunities for that. For example, in Canada, and a very much an emerging field and starting to have an impact is Indigenous legal orders being recognized in Supreme Court decisions, and now Indigenous peoples here are starting to want to codify documents, Indigenous laws, so they can start being related to how we go about environmental governance. I think being able to advance the Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, how can that be taken seriously? And even if it's not necessarily taken seriously by nation states, by the actions of people and different organizations that would support Indigenous people. So for example, Canada did not support UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples right away when it was accepted in the UN in 2007. It was until several years later, but it didn't mean that First Nations still weren't holding the Crown accountable during that time. So in my view, what the state does matters, but it doesn't have to hold Indigenous peoples' backs and others. So we can still advance these ideas with or without the states, in our case, the Crown support. And I also think we can just be creative and innovative in terms of starting to think about what governance, what environmental governance might look like under concepts of the with the earth. What might these actually look like to start being visionary in terms of how we think. And again, these things can be scaled up and down in terms of the work that we do. So that's just a very brief summary of the chapter that I wrote in terms of the highlights and where I think some future research might go. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Deb.